I asked when the wedding is, and my daughter said, I got married yesterday. You aren't invited, it's just for special people. A week later she called. Did you transfer it? I replied, didn't I tell you? So there I was, standing in my living room like some kind of condemned man waiting for the executioner, staring at my phone like it was about to explode in my hand. My wife Clara was doing that thing she does where she pretends she's not listening, while simultaneously listening, so hard I'm surprised her ears weren't literally growing bigger. She was over by the window with that dusty watering can we've had since the Clinton administration, giving attention to a plant that I'm 90% sure is plastic, and the performance was about as subtle as a freight train crashing through a library. I could feel her eyes boring into the side of my head every 3 seconds, waiting for me to make the call that had been hanging over us like a dark cloud for the past week. I'd been rehearsing this conversation in my head for days now, running through different scenarios like some kind of deranged method actor preparing for the role of dad who actually wants to know when his daughter's getting married. I'd practiced the casual tone, the supportive but not too pushy inflection, the perfectly calibrated level of enthusiasm that wouldn't make me sound desperate but also wouldn't make me sound like I didn't care. The same kind of nerves I had back when I was 22 and walked into Henderson's auto shop for my first real job interview, sweating through my only button-down shirt and praying I wouldn't say something stupid like, I've always been passionate about, cars and stuff. Spoiler alert, I definitely said exactly that, and somehow still got the job, which either says something about my charm or the desperately low standards of 1970s automotive retail. I hit the call button before I could chicken out for the 15th time that morning. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and with each ring my stomach did another impressive gymnastics routine that would have scored at least a 7.5 from the Russian judge. Clara had now completely abandoned all pretense of watering the fake plant and was just standing there, watering can frozen in midair like a statue in the world's most anxious garden center. On the 4th ring, Leah picked up, and I could hear that particular tone in her voice right away, the one that told me this conversation was already going to be about as pleasant as a root canal performed by a drunk dentist with a grudge. Hey, sweetheart. I started, going for warm and casual, but probably landing somewhere closer to hostage reading a ransom note. My throat felt like I'd swallowed a handful of sand from the driveway. So, I've been meaning to ask you, and your mother and I were just wondering, about the wedding and everything. When exactly is the big day? We want to make sure we've got everything sorted out, with my work schedule, and Clara wanted to get her hair done, and I need to pick up that lavender tie from the dry cleaners, the one I bought specifically for this occasion. Remember I told you about it? I was rambling. I knew I was rambling. I sounded like a telemarketer who'd lost his script and was just hoping enthusiasm could carry him through to the sale. There was a pause on the other end of the line. One of those loaded silences that lasts approximately 2 seconds, but feels like you've aged several years waiting for the other shoe to drop. I could practically hear Leah rolling her eyes through the phone, that particular cosmic frequency that all daughters emit when they're about to say something that's going to ruin your entire week. Then her voice came through, sharp and clear and dripping with the kind of smugness usually reserved for people who just won an argument on the internet against someone who can't spell. Oh, she said, with this little laugh that made my blood pressure immediately spike into the danger zone. We got married yesterday. It was just a small thing, really intimate, just for special people. I'm going to be honest with you. I've been called a lot of things in my 63 years on this planet. I've been called boring by my college roommate who thought my idea of a wild Friday night being a deck of cards and some reasonably priced beer was somehow a character flaw. I've been called stingy by my brother-in-law who never met an open wallet he didn't want to reach into. I've been called allergic to fashion by literally everyone who's ever seen me in cargo shorts, which I maintain are practical and comfortable, and I don't care what the fashion police have to say about it. But never, not once in my entire life, had I been called not special enough to attend my own daughter's wedding. Not special enough to watch the little girl I taught to ride a bike walk down the aisle. Not special enough to be there for one of the most important days of her life, despite the fact that I'd been there for literally every other day of her life since the moment she came screaming into this world at St. Mary's Hospital weighing 7 pounds and 3 ounces. I just stood there like an idiot, phone pressed to my ear, staring at the half-painted accent wall behind the couch that I'd been meaning to finish for the past 3 months. wondering if this was real life or if I'd somehow slipped into an alternate dimension where up is down and daughters don't invite their fathers to their weddings. The paint job suddenly seemed like a very good metaphor for my relationship with Leah, half finished and kind of a mess, and probably never going to get completed at this point. My brain was doing that thing where it completely short circuits and you can't form words. You just make this kind of static noise like a radio stuck between stations. Clara's eyes went wider than I've ever seen them. And this is a woman who once watched me accidentally set the garage on fire trying to deep fry a turkey, so that's saying something. The watering can finally dropped from her hand, hitting the hardwood floor with a thud that seemed way too loud in the sudden, terrible silence of our living room. "What did she say?" she asked, her voice climbing up into that register that meant she was about 5 seconds away from either crying or committing a felony, possibly both. I cleared my throat, trying to find my voice somewhere in the wreckage of my dignity. "She said I'm not special enough to attend my own daughter's wedding," I replied, and hearing the words out loud somehow made it even worse, like saying it gave it more power, made it more real. Apparently the years I spent paying her rent while she found herself don't count as VIP treatment. Neither does the time I bought what she called essential business equipment for Travis's cryptocurrency venture that I'm pretty sure was just an elaborate scheme to buy a really expensive gaming computer, or the student loans I helped with, or the car insurance I covered, or the emergency dental work, or the security deposit on 3 different apartments because she kept deciding she didn't like the vibes of various neighborhoods. Clara just stood there shaking her head, and I could see her mentally calculating the same numbers I'd been trying not to think about for the past 3 years. "What kind of person does that?" she whispered. But it wasn't really a question, more like she was just saying words to fill the horrible silence that had settled over us like a fog made of disappointment and broken expectations. That night, I couldn't sleep, which wasn't exactly unusual lately, but this was different. I sat in my recliner in the dark, the one I'd bought on sale at that furniture warehouse place after my back started acting up, staring at the lavender tie hanging on the coat rack by the door. I'd bought it specifically for the wedding, spent an embarrassing amount of time at Men's Warehouse trying to find the perfect shade that would complement whatever color scheme Leah had chosen, which she'd mentioned exactly once in a phone call 3 months ago, and I'd written down on a post-it note like it was the nuclear launch codes. I'd even practiced smiling in the bathroom mirror while wearing it, trying to look like the proud father of the bride instead of a guy who looked vaguely constipated and uncomfortable in formal wear. Now the tie just hung there mocking me, a lavender-colored symbol of my complete and utter failure as a father, or at least that's what it felt like at 2:30 in the morning when everything feels worse and your brain won't shut up. I'd been rehearsing for a role that got canceled without anyone bothering to tell me the show was off. I was the understudy who showed up ready to perform only to find out the theater had been demolished and everyone had gone home. All those years of parenting, of trying to be supportive and present and financially generous to a fault, and I couldn't even make the guest list for the main event. Somewhere in the distance a dog was barking, and I thought about how even that dog probably had more people who considered it special than I apparently did. The thought was so ridiculous and self-pitying that I almost laughed, but it came out more like a sad little exhale that fogged up my reading glasses. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a garbage truck driven by my own disappointment, which is a very specific kind of terrible that I don't recommend to anyone. My back hurt from falling asleep in the recliner at some ungodly hour. My neck was stiff from the angle I'd been slouched at, and my phone was buzzing on the coffee table like an angry wasp that had somehow learned to use technology. I reached for it with all the enthusiasm of a man reaching for a live grenade, squinting at the screen through eyes that felt like they'd been replaced with sandpaper sometime during the night. Clara was already up. I could hear her in the kitchen doing that thing where she aggressively makes coffee when she's upset, slamming cabinet doors and clattering mugs around, like she's performing in a percussion ensemble dedicated to expressing maternal rage. I unlocked my phone and there it was, right at the top of my Facebook feed, because of course the universe has a sixth sense of timing and algorithms apparently run on pure malicious intent. A photo album titled Our Special Day, with about 47 pictures, each one more painful than the last, like someone had designed a slideshow specifically to cause maximum emotional damage to fathers who apparently didn't make the cut. Leah stood there in her wedding gown, the same dress she'd called me about 8 months ago, sobbing about how she absolutely needed it, and how it was her dream dress, and how if she didn't get this specific dress from this specific boutique her entire life would be ruined forever. The dress that cost more than my first car, the one she told me was essential for her mental health and sense of self-worth, the one I paid for under the creative accounting category of student loan stress relief, because apparently that's what we're calling wedding expenses these days when you don't want to admit you're bleeding your father dry. She looked beautiful, I'll give her that, even through my haze of betrayal and sleep deprivation. The dress fit perfectly, all that lace and beading and whatever else they put on wedding dresses that makes them cost as much as a decent used sedan. Her hair was done up in one of those complicated arrangements that probably required an engineering degree to accomplish, and her makeup was flawless in that way that makes people look like they're glowing from within, which I'm pretty sure is just expensive highlighter, but what do I know about cosmetics? Next to her stood Travis, her new husband, grinning like he'd just won the lottery without having to buy a ticket, which I guess in a way he had since he'd married into the bank of dad, without having to pass a credit check or show proof of employment beyond his consulting business that, as far as I could tell, consisted of posting motivational quotes on LinkedIn. They looked like they'd been pulled straight out of a toothpaste commercial, all gleaming white smiles and perfect posture and the kind of happiness that makes you want to either congratulate them or check them for performance-enhancing drugs. Behind them in various shots stood Travis's parents, Bob and Diane, who I'd met exactly twice, and who had looked at me both times like I was something stuck to the bottom of their designer shoes. They were in multiple photos looking proud and proper and like they'd just adopted royalty into their family bloodline, which apparently now included my daughter, who was too good to invite her own father, but not too good to spend his money on creating this picture-perfect fantasy wedding that I was now viewing through a screen like some kind of digital ghost haunting the event I should have been attending. And me? Where was I in these photos? Nowhere. That's where. I was conspicuously absent from every single shot, erased from the narrative like a character cut from the final edit of a movie. I looked at my own involvement in this whole production and realized I was basically like one of those anonymous financial donors whose names appear in the tiny print at the end of museum plaques that nobody reads. This wedding was made possible in part by a grant from the Foundation of Gullible Fathers Who Don't Know When to Stop Writing Checks, with additional funding provided by retirement savings that could have been a boat. I scrolled through the entire album with the kind of morbid fascination usually reserved for watching car crashes or reality TV shows about hoarders. There were photos of the ceremony, the reception, the cake cutting, the first dance, all these traditional wedding moments that I'd assumed I'd be part of because, you know, I'm her father, and that's generally how these things work in most functional families. There was even a photo of Travis's dad giving a toast, raising his glass with this big emotional smile, probably talking about how proud he was and how happy they were to welcome Leah into their family. And I thought about how I should have been the one doing that. I should have been the one standing up there embarrassing my daughter with dad jokes and getting a little teary-eyed and reminiscing about teaching her to ride a bike and watching her graduate high school. I sat there on my couch staring at these photos, muttering to myself like a crazy person, "Oh look, special people having a special time with my not-so-special money." The irony was so thick you could cut it with the cake knife they were using in photo number 17. Every flower arrangement I saw, I mentally calculated the cost. Every centerpiece, every chair cover, every string of those trendy Edison bulbs hanging in the background. I could practically see the dollar signs floating above them like some kind of depressing augmented reality app designed to show you exactly how much your own child's betrayal cost you down to the penny. Clara appeared in the doorway with 2 mugs of coffee, took one look at my face, and immediately knew what I was looking at. She has this sixth sense about these things, probably developed over 40 years of marriage to a man whose face apparently broadcasts his emotions in high definition. "You should comment something nice," she said, sitting down next to me and handing me one of the mugs, which I accepted even though my hands were shaking slightly, and I was pretty sure adding caffeine to my current emotional state was like throwing gasoline on a dumpster fire. "Oh, I will," I said, and my fingers were already moving across the screen before my brain could catch up with what a monumentally bad idea this was. I typed out, "Congratulations. I see my credit card finally got to walk you down the aisle since I didn't. So proud of my visa for this special moment. Really beautiful ceremony. Wish I could have been there. but I understand that Discover and MasterCard probably took up all the good seats. I stared at the comment for a good 30 seconds, my thumb hovering over the post button like a nuclear launch officer contemplating starting World War III. The petty part of me, which I'm discovering is a much larger part than I previously thought, desperately wanted to hit that button. Wanted to see that comment appear under those perfect photos. Wanted to watch the awkward questions from relatives who didn't know I hadn't been invited. Wanted to create even a fraction of the discomfort I was currently experiencing. But then the part of me that still functions like a rational adult human being, the part that Clara was currently staring at with those eyes that mean, "Don't you dare," made me highlight the whole thing and delete it character by character. Even my sarcasm has limits, apparently, though I'm learning those limits are a lot further out than I thought they were. I settled for just liking the post, which felt like the social media equivalent of saying, "I acknowledge that this thing happened even though you deliberately excluded me from it. And I'm going to be the bigger person here, even though it's killing me inside." Then I put my phone face down on the coffee table, picked up my coffee mug, and took a long drink of something that tasted like bitterness and regret with a hint of French roast. Clara patted my knee in that way that meant she was proud of me for not starting a public social media war. But we both knew that this whole situation was far from over, and that eventually something was going to give, because you can only push a man so far before he stops being civilized and starts being honest. A week crawled by like a wounded animal dragging itself across hot pavement, each day blending into the next in a blur of me pretending I was fine and Clara pretending she believed me. I'd been going through the motions of normal life, showing up at the hardware store where I work part-time because retirement turned out to be boring as hell and I needed something to do besides stare at walls and contemplate my failures as a parent. I'd been helping customers find the right size screws and explaining the difference between interior and exterior paint with all the fake enthusiasm I could muster, which wasn't much, but apparently was enough to fool people who just wanted to fix their leaky faucets and didn't care about my emotional state. Then on Tuesday afternoon, right when I was in the middle of reorganizing the electrical section because someone had mixed up the wire gauges and it was driving me insane, my phone started buzzing in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw Leah's name on the screen, and I'm not going to lie, my first instinct was to just let it ring through to voicemail and deal with whatever fresh nightmare she was calling about later when I'd had time to mentally prepare myself. But curiosity is a stubborn thing, like a dog that won't stop barking until you give it attention, and despite every instinct telling me this was going to ruin my day, I swiped to answer. "Dad?" she said, and I could already hear it in her voice. That particular tone she uses when she wants something. The one that starts out sweet like honey but has this desperate edge underneath it like artificial sweetener that leaves a weird aftertaste. It's the same voice she used when she was 16 and wanted to borrow the car, or when she was in college and needed emergency money for textbooks that I later found out meant emergency money for concert tickets. "Dad, hi, how are you? How's Mom? I've been meaning to call. Things have just been so crazy with the move and everything." The move. Right. The move into the apartment that I'd been paying rent on for the past 3 years. The one she apparently was still living in with her new husband, who I'm sure had lots of opinions about interior decorating, but zero opinions about contributing to the actual cost of having a roof over his head. I waited, not saying anything, just letting the silence stretch out between us like taffy because I knew exactly where this was going and I wanted her to have to work for it. "So anyway," she continued, and here it came right on schedule. "The rent's due tomorrow, and I noticed you forgot to make the transfer this month. I'm sure it just slipped your mind with everything going on. You know how busy you are at the store and everything. So I just wanted to remind you before it's late, and we get hit with fees." I took a deep breath, the kind of breath you take before you jump into cold water or tell your boss exactly what you think of his management style. I was standing in aisle 7 surrounded by circuit breakers and outlet covers. And I had this moment of perfect clarity where I realized I was absolutely done being the ATM that everyone just assumed would keep dispensing cash forever without any kind of appreciation or basic human decency. "Didn't I tell you?" I said, and my voice came out calmer than I expected, almost pleasant, which somehow made what I was about to say even better. "I only help special people now. It's my new policy. Special people only. Very exclusive." The silence on the other end of the line was so satisfying I almost heard her jaw physically drop and hit whatever expensive hardwood floors I'd helped pay to install. I could picture her standing in her kitchen, probably wearing some trendy athleisure outfit that cost more than my entire wardrobe, her phone pressed to her ear, trying to process what I'd just said, because clearly she'd expected me to just roll over and apologize for the inconvenience of not funding her lifestyle on the exact schedule she'd become accustomed to. "Dad," she finally said, and now the sweetness was completely gone from her voice, replaced by this sharp edge that could have cut glass. "Don't be cruel. This isn't funny. We have bills to pay. You can't just suddenly decide to stop helping us without any warning." Cruel. She called me cruel. The man who'd spent the better part of the last decade making sure she never had to worry about money, who'd covered her rent and her car insurance and her student loans and her mysterious business expenses and her emergency dental work, and probably funded half of Travis's wardrobe of designer sneakers that he wore while not having a real job. That man was being cruel because he finally grew a spine. "Cruel?" I said, and I could feel this laugh bubbling up from somewhere deep in my chest. The kind of laugh that has absolutely nothing to do with humor and everything to do with the absurdity of the entire situation. "Sweetheart, let me tell you about Cruel. Cruel is not inviting your father to your wedding because he's not special enough. Cruel is posting 47 photos of an event I paid for but wasn't allowed to attend. Cruel is calling me only when you need money and pretending it's a real relationship." I was on a roll now. 3 years of bottled-up resentment flowing out of me like water from a burst pipe, and it felt amazing in the way that finally saying what you really think always feels amazing even when you know there's going to be consequences later. "I paid your rent for 3 years, Leah. 3 years. That's not cruelty. That's charity. That's me being a walking, talking nonprofit organization dedicated to funding the lifestyle of someone who apparently thinks I'm not worth a seat at her wedding. So here's the thing. And I want you to really hear this because I'm only going to say it once. The Bank of Dad is officially closed. Shuttered. Out of business. We're not even offering those predatory payday loans anymore. You want rent money? Ask your special wedding guests. Ask Travis's parents who looked so proud in all those photos. Ask your husband to get an actual job that pays in real money instead of cryptocurrency dreams and LinkedIn engagement. You can't do this, she said. And now she sounded like she was gearing up for a full meltdown. That quiver in her voice that used to make me cave immediately because I couldn't stand the thought of my daughter being upset. But something had fundamentally changed in me over the past week. Some essential piece of the mechanism that made me an easy mark had finally broken beyond repair. "We have a lease. We have responsibilities. You can't just abandon us like this." "Watch me," I said. And then I did something I'd been wanting to do for longer than I cared to admit. I hung up, just pressed the red button, and ended the call like I was some kind of action hero delivering a one-liner before the dramatic scene cut. I stood there in aisle 7 holding my phone, staring at the circuit breakers, and I felt lighter than I had in years, like I'd been carrying around an invisible backpack full of rocks, and had finally just shrugged it off and let it fall to the floor. I walked back to the break room where my coworker Dennis was eating a sandwich and scrolling through his phone. "You okay, man?" he asked, probably noticing the slightly manic look on my face. "You look like you just won the lottery or committed a crime. I can't tell which." "Both," I said, pouring myself a cup of the terrible break room coffee that tastes like it was brewed in a tire factory. "I just committed the crime of setting boundaries, and the prize is my sanity." I sat down at the plastic table that had seen better days, probably around the same time I'd still had a functional relationship with my daughter, and took a sip of coffee that tasted like freedom mixed with discount beans. "Dennis, let me tell you something. Don't have kids. Or if you do have kids, make sure you stop paying their bills before they start thinking of you as a human credit card instead of a human being." Dennis nodded slowly, the way you nod at someone who might be having a breakdown, but you're not quite sure yet. "Noted," he said. "That's some specific advice." That evening I sat by the window in my recliner, the same spot where I'd been doing most of my contemplating lately, watching the sun go down and turning the sky into this painting of oranges and purples that reminded me that the world keeps turning whether your daughter appreciates you or not. Clara brought me a beer without me asking for one, which is the kind of thing that happens when you've been married long enough that your spouse develops psychic abilities about when you need alcohol. I took it and whispered to myself, quiet enough that Clara couldn't hear, but loud enough that it felt real. This tastes like freedom. And you know what? It really did. That afternoon, I decided it was time to do something I'd been avoiding for approximately 3 years, which was taking a good hard look at exactly how much money I'd poured into the black hole of my daughter's financial needs. Not because I'm a masochist, though at this point I was starting to wonder, but because I needed to see the damage in black and white, needed to quantify exactly how much my unconditional love had cost in actual dollars and cents. It's like when you avoid checking your credit card statement after a particularly irresponsible shopping spree. Except this shopping spree had lasted for 3 years, and I hadn't even gotten to keep any of the stuff I'd bought. I spread out everything across the dining room table like I was conducting an autopsy on my own wallet, which I guess in a way I was. Bank statements, credit card receipts, copies of checks I'd written, Venmo transactions that I'd screenshotted, because even then some part of me knew I should be keeping records of this insanity. There were rent receipts going back 36 months in a neat little stack that looked like a monument to my own stupidity. Grocery bills from all those times Leah had called saying she was broke and needed help with food, which somehow always coincided with her posting Instagram photos from trendy brunch spots that charged $18 for avocado toast. Loan repayments for student debt that I later discovered had actually been paid off 2 years ago, but she'd just kept accepting my help because I guess when someone's dumb enough to keep giving you money, you don't exactly stop them. Then there were the more creative expenses, the ones that really showcased Leah's talent for storytelling. The emergency puppy surgery that supposedly saved her neighbor's dog, which cost me $800 and which I'm now about 70% sure never actually happened, because I never saw any photos of this miraculous recovery, and Leah's not exactly the type to save a dog's life and not post about it for the social media clout. The spa trips that were marketed to me as essential mental health care, because apparently my generation doesn't understand that self-care costs $200 and involves hot stones and eucalyptus steam rooms. The business equipment for Travis's various entrepreneurial ventures, which as far as I could tell involved him sitting on the couch with an expensive laptop posting about cryptocurrency and hustle culture while contributing exactly $0 to their household expenses. I pulled out my calculator, the same one I'd been using since 1987 that still worked perfectly fine despite Clara's insistence that I could just use my phone, and I started adding it all up. Rent payments, $1,200 a month for 36 months. Insurance premiums. Utility bills that somehow I'd gotten roped into covering. Emergency car repairs for a car that seemed to have more emergencies than a daytime soap opera. Medical copays. Dental work. That time she needed a new laptop because hers had died suddenly, which I later learned meant she'd spilled an entire glass of wine on it during a party. The security deposits for 3 different apartments because she kept deciding she didn't like the vibes of various neighborhoods, which is apparently something people get to do when they're not the ones paying for it. The calculator kept climbing, the numbers getting bigger and more depressing with each entry. 5,000, 10,000, 20,000. I kept going, my hand getting crampier with each button press, sweat starting to form on my forehead even though the air conditioning was on full blast. 25,000, 30,000, 34,000. I hit the total button one final time and stared at the number like it was going to change if I looked at it long enough, like maybe I'd made a mistake, and it was actually $34 instead of $34,600. $34,600. I sat back in my chair and just stared at that number, letting it really sink in, letting it marinate in my brain until I could fully appreciate the magnitude of my own financial stupidity. I could have bought a Tesla, I muttered to myself, thinking about that sleek electric car I'd been eyeing for the past year, the one Clara kept saying we should splurge on because we'd earned it after decades of being responsible. Instead, I bought entitlement. I bought a 3-year subscription to being taken advantage of. I invested heavily in the stock market of ungratefulness, and somehow I'm shocked that the returns were terrible. I looked at all those receipts spread across my dining room table and felt something shift inside me, some final piece of denial crumbling into dust. This wasn't parenting. This wasn't helping my kid get on her feet. This was enabling, pure and simple, and I'd been doing it with a smile on my face while she systematically drained my retirement savings and didn't even have the decency to invite me to her wedding. I grabbed my phone and did something that felt simultaneously petty and absolutely necessary. I took a photo of all the receipts spread out on the table, this colorful mosaic of my own gullibility, and I sent it to Leah with a message that probably wasn't going to win me any Father of the Year awards, but felt absolutely perfect in the moment. In case you ever miss me, I typed, just look at your furniture. Look at your dishes. Look at your walls and your floors and your ceiling. I'm literally everywhere. Every stick of furniture, every plate you eat off of, every light bulb illuminating your special life. That's all me. You're basically living in a museum dedicated to my poor financial decisions. Enjoy the exhibit. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, and then I did something that felt even better. I grabbed my keys, got in my car, and drove straight to First National Bank like I was on a mission from God. The bank where I'd set up all those automatic payments 3 years ago when Leah had first asked for help, back when I was naive enough to think this would be temporary, that she just needed a little boost to get started in life. Back when I still believed that being a good father meant saying yes to everything and never expecting anything in return except maybe the occasional phone call that wasn't about money. I walked through those automatic doors with the kind of determination usually reserved for people storming castles or quitting terrible jobs in spectacular fashion. Mr. Khan was at his desk, the same bank manager who'd helped me set up the automatic transfers, a nice guy in his 50s who always remembered my name and asked about my family, which now felt ironic given what I was about to do. He looked up and smiled when he saw me approaching. Mr. Anders, good to see you. What can I help you with today? Cancel every automatic payment to Leah and her husband, I said without preamble, pulling out my phone to show him the account details. Every single one. Rent, utilities, insurance, everything. If it's going to either of them, I want it stopped immediately. Mr. Khan blinked at me, his fingers hovering over his keyboard like he wasn't sure he'd heard me correctly. Sir, you've never missed a payment in 3 years. These are all scheduled to go out like clockwork. Are you sure you want to cancel them? Is there a problem with the amounts? The problem, I said, and I could feel this smile spreading across my face that probably made me look slightly unhinged, but I didn't care, is that I've spent 3 years being an ATM for someone who thinks I'm not special enough to attend her wedding. The problem is I just calculated that I've given away $34,600 to someone who only calls me when she needs something. The problem is I finally realized that my biggest character flaw isn't being cheap or stingy or whatever else people have called me over the years. My biggest character flaw is that I'm too generous with people who don't deserve it. Mr. Khan looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something change in his expression, this flicker of understanding like he'd just connected some dots. My daughter asked me for $5,000 last month for a down payment on a car, he said quietly, pulling up my account on his screen. I said no because she still owes me $2,000 from last year. She didn't talk to me for a week. He started clicking through menus, his fingers moving efficiently across the keyboard. I'm canceling all automatic payments now, Mr. Anders. Every single one. I watched him work, feeling this weight lifting off my shoulders with each confirmation number he read out to me. Payment canceled. Payment canceled. Payment canceled. It was like listening to a surgeon announce that they'd successfully removed a tumor, each cancellation making me lighter and freer and more like myself than I'd felt in years. When he was done, he printed out a confirmation sheet and slid it across the desk to me, and I looked at it like it was a diploma or a medal or some kind of official document declaring my independence. Is there anything else I can help you with today? Mr. Khan asked, and there was this hint of a smile on his face like he knew exactly what I was going through because he'd been there himself in some version of this same story. Actually, yeah, I said, folding up the confirmation sheet and putting it in my wallet like a talisman against future weakness. I want to set up a new automatic payment to my own savings account. Same amount I was paying for Leah's rent. $1,200 a month, starting today. Mr. Khan's smile got wider. Now that, he said, is the best financial decision you've made in a while. I walked out of that bank like a man who'd just divorced his direct debit, like I'd ended a toxic relationship with being taken advantage of, and for the first time in a week, I felt something that wasn't just anger or disappointment or betrayal. I felt hopeful. I felt free. I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could finally start living for myself instead of funding someone else's life while mine passed me by. A few days later, I came home from the hardware store feeling pretty good about life, which should have been my first warning sign that the universe was about to remind me that happiness is temporary and chaos is always lurking around the corner, waiting to ruin your afternoon. I'd spent the day helping a nice elderly woman pick out paint colors for her bathroom remodel, and she'd reminded me of my own mother with her polite questions and genuine appreciation for help, which was refreshing after dealing with my own family, who seemed to think gratitude was a foreign language they'd never learned to speak. The sun was shining. I had a sandwich waiting for me in the fridge, and I was planning to spend the evening watching baseball and not thinking about my ungrateful daughter for at least 3 consecutive hours. Then I turned onto my street and immediately felt my good mood evaporate like water on hot asphalt. There were 3 strange cars parked in front of my house, expensive-looking vehicles that definitely didn't belong to any of my neighbors who mostly drove sensible sedans and the occasional minivan. A sleek black Mercedes that probably cost more than I made in a year, a silver Lexus SUV with custom rims that screamed, "I make poor financial decisions," and a white BMW that had one of those vanity plates that said something obnoxious like WANR or success, or whatever lawyers put on their cars to announce their profession to everyone stuck behind them in traffic. My stomach immediately dropped into my shoes because I just knew with every fiber of my being that whatever was happening inside my house was going to make me want to commit a felony. I parked my truck in the driveway behind the Mercedes, effectively blocking it in because petty spite is free and I'm budget conscious, and walked up to my own front door with all the enthusiasm of a man approaching a firing squad. I could hear voices inside, multiple people talking in that fake polite tone that people use when they're about to screw you over but want to pretend they're doing you a favor. I opened the door, which wasn't locked because apparently we were having an open house that nobody bothered to tell me about, and froze in the doorway like I'd just walked into a surprise party, except instead of friends and cake it was my worst nightmare come to life. Leah was sitting on my couch like she owned the place, which technically I guess she thought she did since I'd been funding her entire existence for the past 3 years. Travis was next to her doing that thing where he tries to look serious and important by crossing his arms and frowning, but mostly he just looked like a kid playing dress-up in grown-up clothes. And sitting at my dining room table, the same table where I'd just conducted my financial autopsy a few days ago, was a man in a shiny suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, including shoes and my one decent winter coat. He had that slick look that screams lawyer, all perfect hair, an expensive watch, and the kind of smile that makes you want to count your fingers after shaking his hand to make sure they're all still there. "Dad," Leah began in that sugar-sweet voice that I now recognized as her manipulation tone, the one she probably practiced in the mirror before important phone calls. "We've been so worried about you. You've been acting so strange lately, so erratic and unpredictable, cutting us off without warning, saying cruel things, making irrational financial decisions. We think you might be experiencing some cognitive decline, and we just want to help." I stood there in my own doorway, still holding my keys, trying to process the absolute audacity of what I was witnessing. Cognitive decline. She was actually standing in my house, the house I paid for, suggesting that I was losing my mind because I'd stopped bankrolling her lifestyle. The nerve of this woman who I'd raised and loved and apparently completely failed to teach the meaning of basic human decency was truly breathtaking in its shamelessness. The lawyer stood up and extended his hand like we were meeting at a networking event instead of him ambushing me in my own home. "Mr. Anders, I'm Jeffrey Bell, attorney at law. Your daughter and son-in-law have retained my services out of concern for your well-being. We're here today to discuss some arrangements that would ensure your finances are properly managed during this difficult time." "Difficult time," I repeated, not shaking his hand, because I'm not a complete idiot and I know that lawyers don't make house calls for social reasons. "The only difficult time I'm having is standing here in my own house wondering who the hell invited you people in." Mr. Bell reached for a leather folder on the table, the kind of folder that probably cost more than a normal person's monthly grocery budget, and pulled out a stack of papers that looked official and intimidating with all their legal letterhead and dense paragraphs of text designed to confuse regular people into signing away their rights. "These are just some simple documents that would allow your daughter to help manage your financial affairs. Nothing major, just ensuring that bills are paid on time, investments are handled properly, that sort of thing. It's really for your own protection." I walked over to the table, picked up the folder with both hands like I was actually considering it, and then did something that felt so good it should probably be illegal. I walked it straight to the kitchen trash bin, the one that currently contained coffee grounds and banana peels and the remnants of last night's dinner, and dropped the entire folder right in on top of the garbage. The sound it made hitting the bottom of that trash can was probably the most satisfying sound I'd heard all week, even better than the click of Mr. Khan canceling those automatic payments. "There," I said, turning back to face the three of them who were all staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to fury to what looked like genuine confusion that their plan wasn't working. Peace of mind restored. Consider my finances officially managed by me, myself, and I, the only people in this room who actually earn the money we're talking about. Leah's face went through about 17 different emotions in 3 seconds, finally landing on red-hot anger that made her look like she was about to start breathing fire. "Dad, don't be difficult. We're trying to help you. You're clearly not thinking straight. You cut us off without any warning. You're making impulsive decisions. You're being hostile and paranoid." "Difficult," I said, and I could feel this laugh building in my chest, the kind of laugh that comes from a place of pure disbelief at the absurdity of the situation. "Sweetheart, let me tell you about difficult. Difficult is raising a child for 25 years. Difficult is working overtime to pay for college. Difficult is sacrificing vacations and new cars and retirement plans to make sure your kid has everything she needs. You know what's not difficult? Finally growing a spine and saying no to someone who thinks I'm an ATM with legs." Travis decided this was his moment to contribute, probably because Leah's face was getting so red I was worried she might actually explode. "Mr. Anders, with all due respect, you're being unreasonable. We had an agreement. We planned our finances around your support. You can't just suddenly change the terms without discussion." "Discussion," I said, turning to look at this man who'd married my daughter and immediately started treating my bank account like it was community property. "You want to talk about discussion? How about we discuss why you've never had a real job in the 3 years I've known you? How about we discuss why I wasn't invited to your wedding, but my credit card was? How about we discuss what exactly you bring to this marriage besides expensive sneakers and motivational LinkedIn posts?" The room went quiet in that way that happens when someone finally says what everyone's been thinking, but nobody had the guts to verbalize. "Mr. Bell cleared his throat, probably calculating how much of his hourly rate he was going to bill for this disaster of a house call. "Mr. Anders, perhaps we should schedule a more formal meeting. Emotions are clearly running high." "No," I said, walking to the front door and opening it wide, letting in the afternoon sunlight and hopefully providing a clear visual cue that this little intervention was over. "We're not scheduling anything. You're leaving. All of you. Right now. This is my house, bought with my money, maintained with my labor, and you're all trespassing." Leah stood up, grabbing her designer purse that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. "You're going to regret this," she said, her voice low and threatening in a way that would have been intimidating if I hadn't spent the last week building up an immunity to her manipulation tactics. "You'll die alone, old and bitter, and you'll realize too late that you pushed away the people who loved you." I looked at her standing there in my living room. This woman who I'd loved since the moment she was born, who I'd taught to ride a bike and helped with homework and walked through every milestone of her life. And I felt something break inside me that I knew wasn't going to heal anytime soon. "Perfect," I said, and I smiled because at this point what else was I going to do, cry? I'd done enough of that already. I'll finally have peace and quiet. Plus all the snacks to myself. No more sharing the good chips with people who only show up when they need something. They filed out one by one. Leah first with her head held high like she was the victim in this situation, Travis following behind looking like a puppy who'd been scolded but didn't understand why, and Mr. Bell last with his expensive briefcase and his probably astronomical bill for services rendered. I stood in the doorway and watched them get into their expensive cars, watched them drive away from my house like they were leaving a crime scene, which I guess in a way they were since they'd just attempted to legally steal my autonomy and financial independence. When the last car disappeared around the corner, I closed the door and leaned against it, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor and everything to do with emotional warfare. Clara appeared from the bedroom where she'd apparently been hiding during the entire confrontation, and she looked at me with eyes that were both proud and concerned. "You okay?" she asked. "I just kicked my daughter out of my house," I said, sliding down to sit on the floor with my back against the door like I was barricading it against future invasions. "I threw a lawyer's paperwork in the trash. I told my son-in-law he's useless. So yeah, I'm either okay or I'm having the breakdown they accused me of having. Honestly, at this point, I'm not sure there's a difference. Clara sat down next to me on the floor, something we probably wouldn't have done 10 years ago when our knees still worked properly, and she took my hand. You did the right thing, she said quietly. They were trying to take everything from you. I know, I said, squeezing her hand and staring at the closed door like it was a shield between me and the chaos that my family had become. The scary part is how close I came to letting them. 3 days after I'd turned my living room into a crime scene by committing the heinous act of standing up for myself, I was in the garage attempting to fix Clara's old sewing machine that had been making concerning grinding noises like it was chewing gravel instead of fabric. I was elbow deep in mechanical parts that I only half understood, operating on pure stubbornness and a YouTube tutorial that kept buffering at the crucial moments, when I heard a car pull up in the driveway. Not just any car, but one of those official-sounding engines that immediately makes you think either you're getting a package or you're about to have a very bad day. And given my recent track record, I wasn't optimistic about the package scenario. I wiped my hands on a rag that was already so dirty it probably made them worse instead of better and walked to the driveway where a woman in a navy blazer was getting out of a sedan that had government plates and the kind of bland, forgettable appearance that screamed bureaucracy. She had a clipboard, which is never a good sign, and one of those smiles that people practice in customer service training where it doesn't quite reach their eyes, and you can tell they'd rather be literally anywhere else doing literally anything else. She looked like she was about to either sell me insurance I didn't need or ruin my week, and I was betting heavily on option 2. Mr. Anders? She asked, approaching me with that clipboard held in front of her like a shield against human interaction. She was wearing sensible shoes and had her hair pulled back in a way that suggested she'd given up on joy sometime around 2015 and had been running on coffee and resignation ever since. I'm Margaret Foster from Social Services. We received some concerns about your well-being, and I'm here to conduct a welfare check. I just stared at her for a moment, letting the absolute audacity of the situation really sink in, marinating in the reality that my own daughter had apparently called social services on me like I was some kind of danger to myself or society. Let me guess, I said, not even trying to hide the sarcasm dripping from every word. These concerns came from my loving daughter who just tried to get me to sign over my finances to her and failed spectacularly. Margaret Foster had the decency to look uncomfortable, shifting her weight from one sensible shoe to the other and glancing down at her clipboard like it might contain instructions for how to handle a situation where the person being investigated was clearly onto the scam. I'm not at liberty to discuss the source of the complaint, Mr. Anders. I'm just here to ensure you're safe and able to care for yourself. It's standard procedure. Standard procedure, I repeated, crossing my arms and probably looking like the world's most defensive mechanic covered in grease stains and righteous indignation. Standard procedure for what, exactly? Making sure I haven't forgotten how to dress myself? Checking if I can still remember my own name? Because I assure you, Miss Foster, I am extremely aware of who I am and what's happening here, which is my daughter using government resources to harass me because I stopped funding her lifestyle. Clara appeared in the doorway of the garage, wiping her hands on a dish towel because apparently we'd both been interrupted in the middle of our respective projects. She took one look at the scene, at me covered in grease facing down a social worker, and I saw her face go through the same journey mine had just completed, from confusion to understanding to barely contained fury. Is this about Leah? She asked, her voice dangerously calm in the way that meant someone was about to get a piece of her mind, and it wasn't going to be pleasant. Ms. Foster opened her mouth to give what was probably a rehearsed speech about confidentiality and procedures, but I cut her off because I was done playing games with people who were trying to paint me as incompetent. You know what? Come inside. Look around. Interview me. Check my vital signs. Give me a pop quiz on current events. Do whatever you need to do to confirm that I'm not drooling on myself or forgetting to wear pants. Then you can go back to whoever sent you here and tell them that their plan to have me declared incompetent has failed just as badly as their attempt to get me to sign legal documents while ambushed in my own home. We walked inside, Miss Foster trailing behind us with her clipboard and her growing awareness that this was not going to be the straightforward case of elder neglect or cognitive decline that she'd probably been told to expect. The house was clean, organized in that way that happens when retired people have too much time and not enough tolerance for clutter. The bills were stacked neatly on the counter, all paid and filed with dates written on them in my handwriting that was perfectly legible despite what my daughter might have suggested about my mental state. The refrigerator was full of actual food, not just condiments in mysterious containers from 2019. There were no safety hazards, no signs of hoarding, no indicators that I was anything other than a reasonably functional adult who was currently very annoyed. But I wasn't taking any chances, because I've learned over the past few weeks that people who want to paint you as incompetent will look for any excuse to make their narrative stick. So I did something that would have seemed paranoid 2 weeks ago, but now seemed absolutely essential to my continued freedom and autonomy. I called my lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but Mr. Patterson, the same guy who'd helped me draft my will 5 years ago, and who had the kind of unshakable calm that comes from dealing with family drama for 30 years. He was a man in his 60s who wore gray suits like they were a uniform, and had probably seen every variation of children trying to screw over their parents that existed in the legal handbook. I hit his number on speed dial, which I'd added after the invasion of the parasites because I'd learned that having a lawyer on retainer was apparently going to be necessary for basic survival. He picked up on the second ring with a voice that sounded like whiskey and courtrooms. "Mr. Anders, what's happening now?" "Social services is in my living room," I said, watching Ms. Foster's expression shift from official procedure to mild alarm as she realized this was not going to be a simple home visit. "My daughter apparently called in a wellness check because I stopped paying her rent. I need you to come over here and help me document that I am, in fact, not senile, just surrounded by people who wish I was." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said without hesitation, and I heard the sound of keys jingling and a door closing. "Don't sign anything, don't agree to anything, and definitely don't let them take you anywhere for evaluation. I've seen this play before, and it never ends well for the parent." While we waited for Mr. Patterson to arrive like Batman in a Buick, I decided to make this as uncomfortable as possible for everyone involved by being aggressively competent. I offered Ms. Foster coffee, which I made properly in our French press, while discussing the optimal water temperature for extraction like I was some kind of caffeinated sommelier. I showed her our monthly budget spreadsheet on the computer, complete with color-coded categories and formulas that would make an accountant weep with joy. I recited the names and birthdays of all my grandchildren, even though Leah had been making it increasingly difficult to see them over the past year for reasons that were now becoming crystal clear. "Miss Foster," I said, sitting down across from her at the dining room table while Clara stood behind me with her arms crossed like a bodyguard made of pure maternal rage. "I understand you're just doing your job, but let me paint you a picture of what's actually happening here. My daughter got married and didn't invite me because I'm not special enough, despite the fact that I paid for her rent, her car insurance, her groceries, and approximately $34,600 worth of other expenses over the past 3 years. When I finally decided to stop being an ATM machine, she tried to get me to sign over power of attorney under the guise of concern for my mental health. When that didn't work, she apparently called you folks hoping you'd do her dirty work for her." Miss Foster was writing things down on her clipboard, and I couldn't tell if she was documenting my mental state or just taking notes on what was clearly becoming a much more complicated situation than she'd been briefed on. "Mr. Anders, can you tell me what day it is? Who's the current president? Can you count backwards from 100 by sevens?" I did all of it, perfectly, while maintaining eye contact and probably looking more alert and oriented than I had in years because spite is an excellent motivator. I counted backwards from 100 by sevens without hesitation, rattled off current events like I was a news anchor, and even threw in some historical facts for good measure, just to show off. By the time Mr. Patterson arrived, briefcase in hand and wearing his courtroom face, Miss Foster looked like she was starting to regret taking this assignment. Mr. Patterson didn't waste time with pleasantries. He sat down at the table, pulled out a folder that was somehow even more intimidating than the one the other lawyer had brought, and proceeded to present evidence of my competence like he was prosecuting a case against the very concept of my cognitive decline. Bank statements showing responsible financial management. Medical records from my doctor confirming I was in good health for my age. Receipts and documents proving that every single automatic payment I'd canceled had been voluntary and deliberate, not the random actions of a confused elderly person. Furthermore, Mr. Patterson said, sliding a piece of paper across the table to Ms. Foster like he was revealing evidence in a murder trial. We have documentation of Ms. Leah Anders and her husband Travis attempting to coerce Mr. Anders into signing legal documents that would have given them control of his finances. We have witnesses, we have dates, and we have a very clear pattern of financial exploitation that Mr. Anders recognized and rightfully put a stop to. Ms. Foster looked at the documents, then at me, then at Mr. Patterson, and I could see her mentally calculating how quickly she could get out of this situation and back to cases that were actually legitimate concerns instead of family drama disguised as elder care. Mr. Anders, she said finally, closing her folder with a definitive snap that sounded like the closing of a case file. I see no signs of cognitive impairment or inability to care for yourself. You are clearly of sound mind and capable of making your own decisions. I'll be noting in my report that this appears to be a family dispute rather than a legitimate welfare concern. I appreciate your thoroughness, I said, standing up to show her to the door because I was raised to be polite even to people who'd been sent to investigate my mental fitness. And I'm sorry you got dragged into this. For what it's worth, I'm sure you've got plenty of actual cases that need your attention, people who really do need help, and I hate that my daughter wasted your time with this nonsense. She nodded, looking relieved to be leaving, and paused at the door. Mr. Anders, off the record? I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've seen a lot of families, a lot of dynamics, a lot of people trying to take advantage of their elderly relatives. What I can tell you is that you're not the problem here. Your boundaries are healthy. Don't let anyone make you doubt that. After she left, I sat back down at the dining room table with Mr. Patterson and Clara, feeling exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the sewing machine repairs I still needed to finish. My own child, I said quietly, staring at my hands that were still stained with grease from the garage. My own daughter tried to have me investigated by social services. That's a new low, even for her. Mr. Patterson packed up his briefcase with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. The good news is that it's all documented now. Every attempt she's made, every failed scheme, it's all on record. If she tries anything else, and I suspect she will because people like this don't give up easily, we'll have a paper trail that shows a clear pattern of harassment and attempted exploitation. That's supposed to be comforting? I asked, even though I knew he was right. No, he said, snapping his briefcase closed. But it's protective. And right now, Mr. Anders, protection is what you need. Your brain's the only thing in this family that's actually working properly. A week later, I was standing in my bedroom staring at my closet like it contained nuclear launch codes instead of decades-old dress shirts and pants that still fit if I didn't breathe too deeply, trying to figure out what exactly one wears to fight off your own daughter in court. The official notice had arrived 3 days ago via certified mail, which meant I had to sign for the privilege of learning that Leah and Travis had filed a petition for guardianship over me, claiming I was mentally incompetent and needed them to legally control every aspect of my life. They wanted to turn me into a living, breathing ATM card with dementia, complete with legal documentation and a judge's signature. Clara had ironed my best suit, the navy one I'd worn to my brother's funeral 5 years ago and hadn't touched since because most occasions in my life don't require looking like I'm about to negotiate a corporate merger. She kept fussing with my tie, adjusting it and readjusting it like if she got the knot perfect somehow this whole nightmare would resolve itself. You're going to be fine, she said for the 17th time that morning, but her hands were shaking and I could tell she was just as terrified as I was that somehow, impossibly, the legal system might side with two people who were clearly just after my money. Mr. Patterson picked us up in his sensible sedan that smelled like leather and legal victories. And during the drive to the courthouse, he briefed me again on what to expect, walking me through the process like a coach preparing an athlete for the championship game, except instead of a trophy, the prize was maintaining basic human autonomy. They're going to paint you as confused, isolated, making irrational decisions. Their lawyer will probably be dramatic, might even have Leah cry on the stand. Your job is to stay calm, answer clearly, and remember that the truth is on your side. The judge has seen this before, and if we present our case properly, he'll see right through it. The courthouse was one of those intimidating buildings designed to make regular people feel small and insignificant, all marble columns and echoing hallways, and the kind of acoustic properties that make every footstep sound like a judgment. We went through security where I had to empty my pockets and take off my belt, which felt like adding insult to injury since I was already being forced to defend my own mental competence to strangers. The courtroom itself was smaller than I expected from watching legal dramas on TV. More like an oversized conference room, with wood paneling and uncomfortable benches that were clearly designed by someone who believed suffering built character. Leah arrived 10 minutes after we did, dressed in all black like she was attending my funeral instead of trying to steal my life. And I had this dark moment of thinking that maybe that's exactly how she saw this, as the death of the father who said no and the birth of the controllable bank account she could manage without resistance. Travis was beside her in a suit that probably cost more than my mortgage payment, looking serious in that way that people who've never had real problems try to look when they're pretending to be concerned. Their lawyer was a woman in her 40s with sharp features and sharper heels, the kind of person who probably charged by the breath and made junior associates cry for sport. We all sat on opposite sides of the courtroom like this was the world's worst wedding, which I guess in a way it was since this was all a direct result of a wedding I hadn't been invited to. The bailiff called the court to order and Judge Collins entered, a man in his 60s with gray hair and reading glasses perched on his nose, and the expression of someone who'd been dealing with family dysfunction since before I was born and had long ago given up on humanity, surprising him with anything new. Leah's lawyer stood up first, smoothing her skirt and arranging her face into an expression of practiced concern that probably played well with juries, but looked fake as hell to anyone paying attention. Your Honor, we're here today because a daughter loves her father so much that she's willing to take on the difficult responsibility of his care. Mr. Anders has been exhibiting concerning behavior, isolating himself from family, making impulsive financial decisions, refusing help from those who care about him most. His daughter fears that without intervention, he'll be vulnerable to exploitation or worse. I had to physically bite my tongue to keep from laughing out loud at the sheer audacity of someone claiming I was vulnerable to exploitation while simultaneously trying to exploit me in a court of law. Clara grabbed my hand and squeezed hard enough that I worried about my circulation, which I interpreted as a nonverbal message to not get us thrown out of court before we even got to present our side. Then Leah took the stand, and I watched my daughter transform into an actress worthy of an Academy Award nomination. Her voice got soft and trembling. Her eyes welled up with tears that might have been real or might have been the result of staring at the courtroom lights without blinking. And she spoke about her concerns with the kind of conviction that would have been moving if I didn't know for a fact that her biggest concern was losing access to my bank account. My father has always been such a loving, generous man, she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that Travis helpfully provided like they'd rehearsed this moment. But lately he's been different, paranoid, angry, cutting us off without explanation. He hangs up on me when I call. He refuses to see reason. He's making decisions that don't make sense. Her lawyer nodded sympathetically, playing to the judge like they were in a performance of Concerned Professionals Care About Old People, the musical. They showed examples of my erratic behavior, which apparently included canceling automatic payments that I'd set up voluntarily, refusing to sign legal documents when ambushed in my home, and generally not doing exactly what Leah wanted exactly when she wanted it. Travis got called up next and did his best impression of a worried son-in-law, talking about how I'd changed, how I wasn't the man he'd known, completely glossing over the fact that the man he'd known had been a walking wallet and the man I'd become had been a walking wallet that finally grew a spine. I leaned over to Mr. Patterson and whispered, "If this goes wrong, remind me to get her an audition for Days of Our Lives. She's wasting this talent on just screwing over her family." He didn't smile, but I saw his eyes crinkle slightly at the corners, which from a lawyer is basically the equivalent of standing ovation. During cross-examination, Mr. Patterson stood up with the kind of calm confidence that comes from knowing you're holding all the winning cards and the other side is bluffing with a pair of twos. "Ms. Anders," he said, his voice polite, but carrying an edge that suggested he was about to dismantle her entire performance with facts and logic. "When was the last time you spoke to your father without asking for money?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and I watched Leah's face go through several expressions as she tried to calculate whether lying would be better than admitting the truth. She blinked, opened her mouth, closed it again, looking like a fish that had just realized it was out of water and the situation was not improving. We talk about lots of things, she finally managed, but her voice had lost that confident, trembling quality and now just sounded uncertain. That's not what I asked, Mr. Patterson continued, and I was starting to understand why people paid this man probably obscene amounts of money to represent them. I asked for a specific date, a specific conversation where you called your father just to check in, just to talk, without any financial request attached. Can you provide one? Silence. Beautiful, damning silence that spoke volumes about exactly what our relationship had become over the past 3 years. Leah looked at her lawyer, who was suddenly very interested in her legal pad, and then back at Mr. Patterson like she was hoping he'd forgotten the question. He hadn't. And is it true? He followed up, moving in for what was clearly going to be the killing blow, that you told your father he wasn't special enough to attend your wedding? Your own father, who you now claim to be so concerned about. That was taken out of context, Leah stammered, and now the tears were gone, and she just looked angry, which was probably closer to her actual emotional state than the concerned daughter routine she'd been performing. I didn't mean it like that. It was a small wedding. We had limited space. Limited space, Mr. Patterson repeated, pulling out a photo from his briefcase, like a magician pulling a rabbit from a hat, except, instead of entertainment, it was evidence. This is a photo from your wedding posted on social media. I count 47 guests. Are you telling this court that out of 47 people, there wasn't room for the man who paid for your rent, your car insurance, and according to our calculations, approximately $34,600 worth of expenses over 3 years? The courtroom got very quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when everyone collectively realizes they're witnessing someone's argument fall apart in real time. Even Judge Collins looked up from his notes with renewed interest, his eyebrows doing that thing where they climb up his forehead like they're trying to escape the situation. Of course there was room, I muttered under my breath, but apparently not quiet enough because a few people in the gallery behind us chuckled, and I saw the judge hide what might have been a smile behind his hand. When it was my turn to take the stand, my hands were shaking, but my mind was clear, clearer than it had been in months, honestly, because anger and righteous indignation are apparently excellent at cutting through brain fog. I looked at the judge, at this stranger who held my future in his hands, and I told him the truth. Your Honor, I raised my daughter with love, patience, and apparently a limitless credit card that I didn't realize I'd signed up for. I worked overtime to pay for her college. I helped with her rent when she said she was struggling. I bought her boyfriend's business equipment when he claimed he was starting a company. I funded every crisis, every emergency, every need that came up for 3 solid years because that's what parents do, right? We help our kids. I took a breath, aware that everyone in the courtroom was listening, that this was my chance to either save myself or sound exactly as crazy as Leah had painted me. But I'm not senile, Your Honor. I'm not confused or mentally declining or any of the things I'm being accused of. I'm just tired. I'm tired of being valued only for my bank account. I'm tired of phone calls that only come when rent is due. I'm tired of being called not special enough to attend my own daughter's wedding, but special enough to pay for it. I'm not making irrational decisions. I'm making the most rational decision of my life. I'm choosing to stop being financially exploited by someone who stopped seeing me as a father and started seeing me as an ATM that occasionally gives unwanted advice. A few people in the gallery actually applauded until the bailiff gave them a look that suggested that was deeply inappropriate for a courtroom setting, but the judge didn't seem to mind. He was writing things down, nodding occasionally, and I couldn't tell if that was good or bad, but at least he seemed to be actually listening instead of just waiting for me to finish so he could rule against me. Mr. Patterson wasn't done demolishing their case, and honestly watching him work was like witnessing a surgeon perform an operation, except instead of removing a tumor, he was removing any credibility Leah had left in that courtroom. He presented bank statements showing every payment I'd made over 3 years, each one documented and deliberate, proving I had perfect control of my finances right up until the moment I decided to stop hemorrhaging money to ungrateful relatives. He showed text messages where Leah only contacted me about money, never about how I was doing or whether I needed anything or just to say hello like a normal human daughter might do. Then came the real bombshell, the evidence I didn't even know we had until Mr. Patterson pulled it out like he was revealing the murder weapon in an Agatha Christie novel. He called up the pharmacist from the drugstore near Leah's apartment, a nervous-looking guy in his 30s named Kevin who clearly wished he was anywhere else but had been subpoenaed and didn't have a choice. Turns out Leah had convinced this poor guy to sign a statement saying I seemed confused when picking up my prescriptions, that I couldn't remember what medications I was taking, that I appeared disoriented and potentially unsafe. The problem with that story, as Kevin reluctantly admitted under oath while avoiding eye contact with everyone, was that I'd never actually been to that pharmacy. Not once. Leah had asked him to sign the statement as a favor, told him it was to help her father get the care he needed, and Kevin had been dumb enough to do it without verifying any of the information because apparently professional ethics are optional when a pretty girl asks nicely. The whole courtroom seemed to inhale collectively, that universal gasp of, oh damn, someone just got caught lying in a really spectacular way. Judge Collins's eyebrows were now fully at his hairline, possibly considering making a permanent move there given how this case was going. Judge Collins leaned forward in his chair with the expression of a man who'd seen enough BS to last several lifetimes and was about to dispense some justice that would probably make him feel better about humanity, or at least slightly less pessimistic. He removed his glasses, cleaned them with a cloth from his robe pocket in that dramatic way judges do when they're about to say something important, and looked directly at Leah and Travis like he was a teacher catching students cheating on the final exam. Mr. Anders is clearly of sound mind, he said, his voice carrying that authoritative tone that comes from decades of dealing with people's worst behavior. In fact, he appears to be one of the more mentally competent people I've seen in this courtroom, which given some of the cases I've presided over is saying something. This petition is denied. Furthermore, this is a textbook case of attempted financial exploitation, and I'm frankly appalled that we're all here wasting the court's time and taxpayer money on what amounts to a family squabble over someone refusing to be a personal ATM anymore. The gavel came down with a sound that felt like vindication mixed with the ending credits of a movie where the good guy finally wins. Boom. Case closed. Petition denied. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in months, like I'd been holding my breath underwater and finally broke the surface. Clara grabbed my hand so hard I thought she might break fingers, but I didn't care because we'd won. We'd actually won, and my daughter's scheme to legally steal my autonomy had just exploded in her face in front of a judge and a courtroom full of witnesses. Leah's eyes burned with fury as she gathered her designer purse, her face the color of a fire engine having a bad day. She leaned in as she passed me, her voice low and venomous enough to kill plants. You'll regret this. You'll die alone, old and miserable, with nobody who cares about you. I smiled, genuinely smiled for the first time in weeks. Perfect. I'll finally have peace and quiet. Plus all the snacks to myself. No more sharing the good chips with people who only show up when they need rent money. Months later, I was sitting in my new apartment downtown, a cozy two-bedroom place that didn't smell like betrayal or decades of accumulated family dysfunction, sipping coffee that I'd made exactly how I liked it without anyone complaining that I made it too strong or too weak, or asking why I couldn't just buy a Keurig like normal people. The place had hardwood floors that creaked in a charming way instead of an alarming way, windows that actually opened to let in fresh air, and neighbors who smiled and said hello instead of trying to get me declared mentally incompetent so they could steal my retirement fund. Clara and I had sold the old house, the one with too many rooms and too many memories of raising a daughter who apparently saw us as an unlimited funding source rather than actual human beings with feelings and financial limitations. We'd split the profit, paid off the last of our debts, and moved into this smaller space that felt more like freedom than any mansion ever could. Turned out we didn't need all that square footage anyway. We'd just been filling it with stuff we didn't need to avoid thinking about relationships that weren't working. I joined a local seniors club that met every Tuesday and Thursday at the community center, a group of people in their 60s and 70s who'd lived full lives and had stories that made mine look tame by comparison. They'd asked me to speak one evening about my experience, and when I stood up in front of 25 people holding coffee cups and cookies from the discount bakery, I started with the line that got the biggest laugh I'd heard in years. My daughter once told me I was special, right before she tried to steal my retirement and have me declared legally incompetent. So I guess I'm here to tell you about the warning signs of financial elder abuse. featuring the cautionary tale of a guy who thought paying rent for 3 years would buy him a seat at a wedding. The room erupted with laughter and knowing nods from people who'd clearly been through their own versions of family dysfunction. An older woman named Dorothy came up to me afterward and said, "My son tried the same thing. Wanted power of attorney, said it was just to help with bills. Thank God my lawyer caught it before I signed anything." We traded war stories like veterans from the same battle. This army of parents who'd learned the hard way that generosity, without boundaries, is just enabling with better PR. These days I drank my coffee without guilt, a revolutionary concept that I was still getting used to after years of feeling like every dollar I spent on myself was somehow stealing from my daughter's future. I'd started traveling to places I'd always wanted to see, but never could because there was always some emergency that needed funding. I'd been to Nashville, saw the Grand Canyon, spent a week in Charleston eating seafood, and walking on beaches that didn't judge me for finally putting myself first. I'd even started flirting harmlessly with my neighbor Margaret, a retired math teacher who laughed at my terrible jokes and didn't ask for money, which was refreshing enough to qualify as a legitimate relationship upgrade. Then one evening my phone buzzed with a message from Leah, the first contact in months. "Dad, we need to talk." I stared at those 4 words, thinking about all the times I'd dropped everything to respond to her, all the times I'd rearranged my life to accommodate her needs, all the years I'd spent being available and generous and apparently completely taken for granted. I typed back slowly, deliberately, choosing each word like I was crafting the most important message of my life. Begin with an apology, not an amount. Then I muted the conversation, turned off my phone notifications for her number specifically, and went back to my book. Later that evening, I stood on my balcony watching the city lights sparkle below like earthbound stars, the sounds of traffic and life, and people living their messy, complicated existences floating up from the streets. I raised a glass of whiskey to the sky, the good stuff that I'd bought without checking the price tag because I'd earned it, and said to no one in particular, but really to myself and the universe and anyone else who might be listening. Here's to all the unspecial people who finally learned the price of peace. Turns out it costs exactly $34,600 and one daughter's entitlement. Best investment I ever made. The whiskey tasted like freedom, like self-respect, like all those years of being taken advantage of finally transforming into something valuable. The knowledge that I deserved better, that saying no wasn't cruel, and that the only person responsible for my happiness was me. And you know what? That was pretty damn special after all.